looks like we're going live. I'll wait for it to show it's truly live. Okay, now we're live. Let's see when the video is. Oh, there we go. Okay. Alright, so in my description pinned comment, I actually borrowed that from the channel The Watchman, because he's so smart in this stuff. So I changed it a little bit, took some of the words out to kind of crop it down so it would fit in here, but I just want to give credit where credit's due. So it is The Watchman on YouTube. And he also has The Watchman 2, so he has two channels. And on that channel he has a link that he wants you, that he suggests you subscribe to as well, that's not YouTube. But he is like one of the prophecywatchers.com. He's one of the best resources for eschatology and end time signs. And my necklace is crooked. Yeah. Anyway, so I just wanted to give credit where credit's due. Because yeah. Anyway, so this video I was on October 15th of last year, like just a week and a day after that horrible genocide happened in Israel. Pastor Ken Merrihew at Calvary Chapel in Oklahoma did an excellent message on the history of Israel and why they're not settlers. They're in the land of milk and honey that God gave them. It's actually his land, but he gave it to his chosen people to live in. I was actually going to look up which king it was that changed the name to Palestine. It wasn't always called Palestine. It used to be Canaan, actually. But I don't remember what king it was. I was going to look it up before I started this, but I got sidetracked. So anyway. So I'm just looking at... That's weird. Why I put that twice? Okay, well, whatever. Anyways, so let's get started. I'm trying to make this not boring. So I'm going to start out, and you'll see this in the thumbnail. Whenever I finish this, I'll put this as the thumbnail. But when we're talking about ethnic cleansing, this is a little bigger so I can see it. Yeah. Okay, so starting back from 1948, when Israel became a state, right? That very same day, 3 Arab countries came against them and went to war with them. Okay? So the Jewish population in different countries from 1948 versus 2023. And the reason why the populations are so dramatically lower is because they were ethnically cleansed. And I cannot read that. Oh, wow. Let me bring it up a different way, because that's just... No, it's not going to do it. Okay, well, I'll bring up the other one I had then. Okay, and then I can use the bottom part of the other one. So anyway, so in Egypt, the population was, in 1948, was 63,550 Jews. As of 2023, there were 3 Jews living in Egypt, because they were ethnically cleansed from Egypt, and you know what that means. Syria, in 1948, 40,000. Now, 0. In Iran, 100,000 in 1948 versus 8,500 now. In Iraq, there was 150,000 in 1948. There's 4 now, 2023, as of 2023. In Lebanon, 20,000 in 1948 versus 29. Like just 29, like less than 30, 29, as of last year. In Morocco, my neighbors are Moroccans. Yay me. In 1948, there were 265,000 Jews living there. As of last year, there's only 2,100. In Yemen, in 1948, 55,000. Now, or as of last year, 1. Algeria, 140,000 versus 200 as of last year. In Libya, in 1948, there were 38,000 versus 0 now, as of 2023. In Tunisia, 105,000 in 1948 versus 1,000 as of last year. In Gaza, 7,949 lived there in 1948 versus 0 as of last year. And on this other screen, what it was saying is this is not, and it's talking about Arab population in Israel. It was like 100 and something thousand. It's really blurry. I can't see it. When I blow it up, it just, let's see if I can try to make it out. Well, okay. Arabs in Israel, 1948, it was 136,000 or 156,000. I can't really tell. Versus 2,100,000 living in Israel as of last year. Arabs in Gaza, there was originally, I want to say that number is 54,000. And in 2023, there's 2 million. 2 million Arabs in Gaza. I'm not sure what the point was on that, but it, you know, at the top where I was talking about how many were there in 1948 versus how many are there now. Let me see what cat's crying at the door. Sorry. Catbird, get your butt in here. Why were you outside the door crying all this time? I'm sorry, baby girl. And they ate your food. Oh, baby girl. Here. Oh, I'll give you some food in a minute. Okay. Anyway, so I just wanted to start with that. And I thought, oh, I don't want to close that. Okay. And then the other thing is, let me just really quick Google it. Make it out of the way. What king was it that renamed Canaan to Palestine? Ango. Oh, it's the Roman Emperor Hadrian is believed to have changed the name of Judea to Palestine. My bad. But there is debate about whether this was done to erase the Jewish presence in the land. Oh, I'm sure it was, because ever since God chose them as their people, Satan and his minions have been coming against them, trying to genocide them, trying to wipe them off the face of the earth. I can tell you now, Hamas is never going to agree to a two-state solution, because they don't want Israel to share the land with them. They want all the Jews killed, and they want to take all of Israel, which we know God is not even going to allow that. The moment they all come against, you know, when they get surrounded, which they are now, and when they all come against Israel, and Israel's on its own because the U.S. isn't backing them, which if Camel Toe gets in office as president, we know she's not going to do it because she hates Israel. But anyway, so let me finish this. The land that is now Israel has been called by many names throughout history, including Canaan, Judah, Judea, Israel, and Palestine. The earliest known name for the area was Canaan, which is where they went because there were giants there. And God had already gotten rid of the giants for him, and he told them to just go on in. Now, he first sent the spies, right? And two of them came back with a good report, and the others was like, oh no, we were like grasshoppers compared to them, and that's how they saw us. You know, and I mean, they brought back a cluster of grapes that they had to carry on poles, 2 of them, because it was just massive. That's how big the fruit grew there because of the giants. But yeah, so that's why they ended up wandering for 40 years until the generation of those 2 spies that didn't trust in God to protect them, because God said, this is the land I'm giving you, so you shouldn't matter what you see there, because you know God's going to take care of it. But they didn't believe or trust, and so 40 years they wandered the desert until that generation was completely gone, because none of them was going to be allowed, like from those 2 guys down, none of them was going to be allowed to enter the land of milk and honey. Palestinian is not a bloodline. It's like people that live in New York are called New Yorkers. People that live in Oklahoma are called Okies, right? But you cannot do a DNA test to see if I have Okie blood, or if I have New York blood, or if I have Palestinian blood. If you do a DNA test on a Palestinian, more than likely they're going to be Egyptian, or Jordan, or both. There is no bloodline. You can't do a DNA test to see if you're Palestinian. It's not a bloodline. Not like Jewish or, you know. The name Palestine can be traced back to the mid-12th century BC, that's before Christ, when the Palisade were mentioned in an inscription in the Medinet Habu temple in Luxor. The Palisade are now known as the Philistines. The term Palestine was used by Herodotus, Herodotus in the 5th century BCE, and other writers followed suit, gradually replacing the name Canaan with Palestine. Thank you very much. So, like I said, the Israelis, the Jewish people, they are not settlers. If anything, the Arabs are, because they're in the land that God gave them. And if you don't believe me, read the Old Testament, read Exodus and Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy. Read them. The first 5 books, the Torah, the Law of Moses, right? And they'll tell you exactly who that land belongs to. But anyway, I digress. Okay, so in his sermon that Pastor Ken taught, it was like the history of Israel. And it would have been better if I would have had the pictures with it, but this medicine I'm on to get cured of tuberculosis, it has me sleeping probably 12 to 16 hours a day. And I hate that. I hate that because all I want to do is sleep. And I knew it was coming. I knew it was going to do that. It said it will cause excessive fatigue, but dang, I didn't realize it meant I would want to sleep all the time. So I don't usually have a whole lot of energy to even do this, but it's my mountaintop time, so I thought I would go ahead and do this since I started it. So I'm basically, word for word for the most part, using the transcript that Pastor Ken Merrihew of Calvary Chapel in Oklahoma preached on October 15th of 2023, like just a week, like the Sunday and a day, it's like a week and a day after that terrible day of October 7th. So on October, you can look it up if you go to Calvary Chapel, Oklahoma City, or Oklahoma, and you look up in their videos for October 15th, you can watch the video of or the sermon that he did where he had pictures to show what he's talking about. It'd be a lot better. I'll even put the link in the description for you. But what he was, he was started off with a couple of passages from Genesis. And he said, I think it would be safe to say that the events of the past several days, now he's talking about what just happened in October of last year, have hampered the Mideast peace process. I think that would be, relatively an understatement as we take a look at the current events. And because of that, because of the gravity of what's been going on since a week ago, yesterday, I thought it'd be best to forego my typical, he didn't do his typical he does verse by verse teaching, like he'll do like so many verses each Sunday and sing it on Wednesday. I love that. I love that they did that because they did the whole Bible and they broke it down and taught so many verses each time, so it wasn't too much at once. I missed that, but I can watch it online, so it's all good, which I do. The current events, and because of what's the gravity. Now, just keep in mind, just since this time last year, or just a couple of weeks from now, how much has happened since then? How close we are to World War III, how close the U.S. is to war with North Korea, how close Israel is to going on full-on war with Iran, if they haven't already, and the stage setting for Ezekiel 38-39, War of Gog and Magog, is just being set up right before our eyes. I do believe that Ezekiel 37 prophecy, when he said prophecy to these dry bones, will they live? And they came back to life. I honestly believe that was God when he, in 1917, started bringing people back to Israel. We brought them all back and they became a nation. Israel became a nation. And then in 1948, they became a state. Right? So I believe that's when that particular prophecy was fulfilled, as well as a lot of people I follow. But anyway, so typically, now some of this I'm adding. So if you don't see me looking down when I'm talking, it's because I'm telling you what I think. So it's not all what he says. I'm going to put some in too. So I'm not going to just read a transcript to you. All right, so, oh, he always starts with a joke, but he didn't this time. He said I usually, outrageously funny opening joke that I usually start with, so I'm just going to kind of pass that today and go right into the message. Yeah, I understand, because, I have descendants that were born in Israel, so I have a hurting heart for those people over there. In Genesis 12:12, verses 7, God says to Abram, he said, the Lord said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. And then down in verse 7 it says, I have hiccups, I'm sorry, that the Lord appeared to Abram and said to your descendants, I will give this land, and excuse me, ma'am. And there Abram built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. And then if we go to the next chapter, chapter 13, verse 15, God says, for all the land which you see I will give to you and to your descendants forever. And the land that's being mentioned here has become known as the land of Israel, or as they say in Hebrew, Israel. And so first of all, as we take a look at this morning, or tonight, we're going to try to make it like it's not simply going to be a history lesson. We're going to have a lot of application with it as well, but I'd like for us to examine what it means. For the Lord to give the land to Israel, to the Jewish people forever. Okay, it all began back during the Canaanite conquest, after they crossed over the children of Israel, after they crossed over the Red Sea. I don't know why I cut that off. The children of Israel left Egypt, wandered around for 40 years, which I already explained why they ended up having to wander. 40 years, crossed over the Jordan, and as they entered into the land of Canaan, now keep in mind there was 2 tribes of Israel that did not cross the Jordan, that stayed on the other side. Anyway, that's another story. 40 years over the Jordan, and as they entered into the land of Canaan and began that conquest about 1400 BC, that was when the fulfillment of this land began. But it came to a very abrupt end in 606 BC with the fall of Jerusalem at the hand of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. And a relatively brief exception, about 200. There was a period of time about 2 centuries before Christ's birth that relatively little exception has been, essentially there has been no autonomous rule in that land until May 14th, 1948. I can never remember the famous author, Mark Twain. Mark Twain. He went to Israel back before, it started budding again in 1917 to see what the land of milk and honey was like. It was a wasteland. There was no inhabiting in that land. That was so bad. No one wanted to live there. You found nothing living there because it was just deserted. Desert, dried up. And he made a comment about, this is, just so I can back up what I'm saying. What did Mark Twain say about Israel when he went to visit it and it was just a wasteland? Palestine, Twain avowed, sits in sackcloth and ashes, and Jerusalem, the stateliest name in history, was in reality a village so small he could circle it. All rags, wretchedness, poverty, and dirt. Anyways, I will continue now. So, yeah, and it was there had been no autonomous rule in that land until May 14th, 1948, when it became a state. So from 606 BC until 1948, there was no nation of Israel because God scattered them. He scattered them and they were no longer allowed to live in the land that he gave them. At least then, but he scattered them. That's why they're all over. We are all over, I should say. There was no nation of Israel. And just so you know, he said he's a timeline kind of guy. And so if we look at a timeline for a few minutes, in the 2nd century, in the first, let's see, oh, I wish I still had that open, darn it. In the first half of the 2nd century, there had been a series of revolts that had taken place in Israel by the Jews against the Roman Empire. Well, the most known one is the one that ended in 70 AD. That's when the temple was destroyed and the fall of Jerusalem. When Titus Vespasian sacked the sea and destroyed the temple. Sacked the sea? I think the transcript must not have got it right. But anyways, destroyed the temple. But then, fast forward from then until the 2nd century in the 130s AD, there was what's known as the Bar Kokhba revolt. And that was when Hadrian, or Emperor Hadrian, was fed up with these cranky little Jews that were all the time causing problems, and so he had destroyed the people. He won the battle, drove them all out of the land, salted the land so it wouldn't grow anything, and then renamed it in the Latin name of Palestina, which was the Latin name for the historical enemies of Jews, the Philistines. And just seeing that as the final slap in the face of the Jewish people, and then drove them out of the land in what became they were dispersed throughout the Roman Empire, and what became known as, in the Latin, the Bora. And for the next approximately 1800 years, the Jews were for the most part driven throughout the Roman Empire and throughout the world. They were without a homeland, and yet managed to maintain for almost 2 millennia. They maintained an unbroken heritage and culture and ethnicity that has been surpassed. In fact, there has been no other people group in the history of mankind that has even come close to that. While they didn't have any nation, that had been dispersed, that has been dispersed, loses its national identity within a generation or two. They maintained their ethnicity and their identity for almost 2,000 years. From the mid, and this is important, I'm going to make several things that I want you to take note of, because your eyes might get kind of glassy-eyed at some point, and you just think this is too much information. I'll point out when there's not too much information, okay? Then when there's something that is really noteworthy, and this statement is really noteworthy. From the mid-Islam began in the early part of the 7th century AD, and from the I have no idea, it's mid-something, I don't know, century, with the first Islamic presence in Israel around the middle of the 1600s, until the post-World War II era. There was never, and if you're taking notes, underline the word never. There was never ever an attempt to establish an Arab homeland in Palestine. Until the post-World War II era, there was never. And if you're taking notes, underline the word never. There was never, ever an attempt to establish an Arab homeland in Palestine. That right there tells you why they are not settlers. That's their land. I'll repeat that. From the mid-7th century until 7th century AD until post-World War II, there was never, ever an attempt to establish an Arab homeland in the land of Canaan, or what was named by Hadrian, the land of Palestine. Nor was there ever, and this would be point number 2 to underline, nor was there ever any ethnic group known as Palestinia. No DNA. You can't get tested to see if you're Palestinian. No ethnic group known as Palestinian. There was, no. The inhabitants of the land were called Palestinians, but there was no ethnic group that was called Palestinian. You understand the difference? New Yorkers, they don't have, that's not an ethnic group. They're called New Yorkers because they live in New York. I'm called an Okie because I live in Oklahoma, but you can't test my blood to see if I have Okie blood, right? Same thing as what I was already saying. Palestinian, that is not a bloodline. Well, unless Palestinians are the ones that have Egyptian and Jordan blood, because that's basically what lives there. Digressing again. But you do understand the difference. If you lived in the land of Palestine, you were called a Palestinian. No matter, Palestinian, matter not what your ethnicity was. Jewish people lived in the land and they were called Palestinians. But there was no ethnic group that went by that name. And starting in the middle of the second millennium, the Turkish Ottoman Roman Empire rose to power, and they ruled for about 400 years, including the land of Canaan during that time period. And here's a map, and this, I was hoping I still had my thing opened up so I could show you the pictures, because I did get some of them, but I'm not sharing my screen, so I couldn't show you anyway. But you can look at his message, the video, and you'll be able to see it. But he had a map showing the extent of the Ottoman Empire. It was a major empire for almost 4 centuries. I'll post the pictures that I did of this particular one. I'll post it in the notes. It was a major empire for almost 4 centuries. And it was Turkey. You see Turkey up there, and well, I'm pointing like you can see. And if you look on the Bible map, it's called Asia Minor, but today it's called Turkey. And this was the Turkish rule over pretty much what was the Roman Empire before, only more so without the addition of Europe. And I've been asked a lot in the past week, and even before, but just a lot in the last week, if I think God is moving the chess pieces around on the board in preparation for wrapping things up. Yes. That's been a very common question that's come to me this week, and I would say yes, I would. I would agree with that statement. But I would also say, as we're going to look at and see, that it was a process that began almost 200 years ago. This moving around of the chess pieces so that he can wrap things up. We have a tendency of thinking, or a tendency of kind of viewing things through our lens, through our time and space, when and then, and because of that, we kind of lose sight of the fact that God doesn't view things that way, and so we tend to kind of view things on our time frame and not God's. But God's is in no hurry. God is in no hurry. And he doesn't play competition chess. There's no time clock on it. And he takes his time, and he sees things on a much grander scale, and he does it in his perfect timing. A grander scale than what we will. And he's not motivated by our impatience, by the way. The modern Zion movement, if we could call it that, that's usually what the historians say, goes back to, had its beginning in the first half of the 19th century, about 200 years ago. And it was the first time since 1844, it was the first time the Jews became a majority of the population in Jerusalem, for the first time in almost 1,700 years. Think about that. There have always been Jews living in Jerusalem. Even when no one else wanted to try to get any kind of Arab leadership going, or anything, not even trying to make it a homeland, nothing. Until post-World War II. But they had been a minority until 1800, just due to migration. In 1844, the Jews outranked or outpopulated any other group, and in 1897, a guy by the name of Theodore Herzl, oh sorry baby, I forgot you were back there, held the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, and the Zionist movement was under full swing. Now if we could just fast forward from there to World War I, so let's just go fast forward a couple of decades to World War II, or World War I, which was from 1914 to 1918. And remember, there was the Ottoman Empire, was Muslim, but it wasn't Arab, okay? If they were Muslim by religion, but they were Turkish by ethnicity. They were the Turks, the Ottoman Turks. They ruled all. And of this part of the world, the whole perimeter of the Mediterranean on down into Saudi Arabia and all of North Africa, and the Arabs during World War I, the Arabs of the area allied with the Britain to overthrow the Turks. Excuse me, I don't know if you noticed, but a lot of Muslims don't get along, and the Muslims, the Arab Muslims, allied themselves with Great Britain during World War One with the Axis powers, or the Central powers, the Axis powers, whereas the Ottomans were aligned with the Axis powers of Germany and Eastern Europe. And there was a Brit by the name of T.E. Lawrence that had been sent from Great Britain over into the Middle East to kind of rally the Arabs in the war effort against the Ottomans. And he just happened to look at an awful lot like, oh, hold on, baby, Peter. A lot like Peter. I don't know. If you're under 40, you probably have to ask somebody who Peter O.U. was. But he looked like a very blue-eyed Arab guy. And he was, it was from the movie Lawrence of Arabia. I know who he's talking about now. Okay. Okay, baby, ow. Ow, that's my boob. Quit scratching. Okay, sorry. He hooked up with a guy that looked an awful lot like Omar Sharif. That's it, yeah. Who played the role in Lawrence of Arabia. He played the role of the sheriff of Mecca. And these guys became pretty good buddies, and they did a really good job of getting the Arabs to unite, all the various Arab groups to unite against the Ottomans. And most of the movie, and most of the history even, I think, was pretty much because most of what we know about that time period we know from him. Lawrence tells us, and so it was probably somewhat exaggerated, he was kind of, he liked his picture in the paper, you know, kind of thing, but they got the job done. And also at that time, especially there were a lot of Jewish guys that were helping Britain in the war effort, especially not only in the Middle East, but especially in Great Britain. And so as a result of trying to, you know, the Arabs were rewarded by overthrowing the Ottomans so that they got their thing did. And the Jews were rewarded by what became known as the Balfour Declaration. It says Bal, F-O-R, for Declaration, but I know it's the Balfour Declaration. And that's how they got their job. There was a guy by the name of the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Baylar. He wrote the Balfour wrote this. Okay, Arthur Balfour wrote this declaration to a guy by the name of Lord Rothschild. Oh, the Rothschilds, well, who was obviously a person of royalty, yeah, with a name like that, and this became an official document of the British Empire. The Fordation, I have no idea what he's saying there. And in it they called for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, and this was done in 1917. It became a state, a nation. So the war wasn't even quite over yet when the Balfour Declaration was established with the fall of the Ottomans. That left a huge power vacuum in the Middle East because they were the nation, you know. They were the country, and all of a sudden, they don't exist, and so you got all these various groups. They were predominantly Arab, but there were different flavors of Arab, if you can understand what I mean by that. And so there was this big power vacuum, and as the saying goes, to the victor go the spoils. Well, the victor here was Great Britain, so they took control of the Middle East, and they were trying to sort this out. They issued the mandate for Palestine, and Churchill, who was the British Foreign Secretary at the time, issued what's become known as Churchill's White Paper in 1922. And in it, he was still calling to honor the Balfour Declaration because, you know, that was the official British policy. But he was under a lot of pressure from the Arabs in the area, and so he kind of somewhat toned it down some. And in it, in the original White Paper of 1922, he said that they were going to limit Jewish immigration to the area. So they were going to limit Jewish immigration, that the Arabs, if they did carve out of this British mandate, this area here that you see on the map, I don't know where he's pointing at, this red area, if there was going to be an area that they would be given over to the Jews for a homeland, the Arabs that were in that area would not be forced to become Israeli citizens or Jewish citizens. Whatever the name of the country wasn't established at that point, but they weren't They weren't going to be forced into what Churchill called a Jewish nationality. Now, this land, that was known as the British Mandate of this land, 80% of it was set aside. Pardon me. There were a period of during the 20s and 30s, there were a series of about 10 more white papers, and in that they decided that 80% of this British mandate would be set aside for the Arabs, and it would be known as Transjordan. That would be the name of this area because it was on the other. Transjordan means across on the other side. The Transjordan means across the Jordan, since they were EAS of east of the Jordan River, I guess. Remember I mentioned earlier there were two tribes that didn't cross over the Jordan? So where those two tribes stayed back because they had better land for their flock and whatnot. So that's what he's talking about. That was going to be the name of that country. It was going to be Transjordan. And then the rest of the white papers was kind of going back and forth of what they were going to do with the other 20%, who was going to occupy that, and would they be autonomous, and what would it be called, and all that sort of thing. So this is going all the way back up, way up to World War II. And I would make a point of underlining number 2. This was the original two-state solution. The original two-state solution. 80% would be Arab and 20% would be Jews. And considering the population was relatively, it wasn't until 80-20, really. It was there were more Jews living in that area at that time than that was fairly equitable solution. And today you hear a lot of talk about this two-state solution. This was the original two-state solution. And it would be the area that would give the Arabs the most area that they would ever have. And today we know it as, from what that area that to have most of the homeland that would have for themselves. Keep in mind that this was before Jordan was a nation. There was no country of Jordan, just like there was no country of Israel. This was just the vacuum of the Ottoman Empire. And so what was then called Transjordan was later shortened to just Jordan. And that was the original area that they had set aside for the Arabs to have as a nation in a homeland. All the Arabs in this that were outside of the Transjordan area, in other words, ow, why are you biting me? All the Arabs that lived on the west side of the Jordan River immediately would be the blue area. And that's the west side is where the 10 tribes of Israel went when they crossed the Jordan. They would be the blue area of the map, which I don't know. I wish I had a picture of that map. I know I have. I'll have to just put it up in the comments. Or you can watch his video, watch his teaching, and you can listen to their praise team too. And for the Arabs that are living in the West Bank and Gaza today, we're going to talk about that more in a minute. So if you're completely unfamiliar with the demographics, we'll come to that. But for the Arabs that are living on the West Bank in Gaza today, claiming that they want a homeland, keep in mind that their fathers, their great-grandfathers, were actually given one 70 plus years ago. And the Kingdom of Jordan, which is what's that red area today, is called the Kingdom of Jordan. They were given that as a homeland then, and yet it was refused by their forefathers. They wouldn't accept that. They wanted all of it, just like they do now, which I think leads up to the today's situation now, following World War II, and the issue of repatriation. I don't know what he's trying to say there, of the land by the Jewish people become a hot button subject once again. It hadn't really, it had in the beginning with the UN. They established the UN after World War II, and so the UN doing what they do, they formed a committee, and so according to the UN, the United Nations Special Commission on Palestine, they adopted that was only supposed to do that part there, no more. That's not even making sense. Do that part right there, no more. No, okay, we got both parts. So they took that area of the Transjordan area of the UN did, and they partitioned it into two relatively equal parts. The blue being that was set, which was set, you can see it's kind of irregular. It doesn't make a whole, it was done according to demographics, and I will find that map and put it in here in the comments, because you'll see what they were offering to do, and Israel was still getting kind of screwed. You know, Israel's given up so much of their homeland, of the land that God promised them. It's just insane, just to keep peace. And the way they had it set, it was like, if I remember correctly, it's kind of like, you know, here's Israel, and then all around them is the others, you know, and it was like really weird the way they did it, and even that wasn't good enough for them. Ow, let go of my hair. And the part that was primarily no, you were in my lap and you wanted to get down. Okay, excuse me a second before I get sliced to death. Just get down now, please, because you're just distracting. No. It was done according to demographics, only so where the majority of the area that was populated by Jewish people, they gave them the blue part, and the part that was primarily populated by the Arabs, they gave them the green part. Okay, and thinking that way, nobody gets displaced, and so it made practical sense in that way. But it was, you know, it's kind of hard to have a country that's in 3 or 4 different places. But the Jews who accepted it, the Arabs did not. The Jews accepted it, but the Arabs did not. And we'll see that has been and will, that's the case from that time forward. It has been the case from that time backward. One of the very few friends, and again, riots and clashes began breaking out in this area between, they had no country. I mean, the Arabs that lived in the country, the Jews that lived in that country were primarily immigrants that had snuck into the nation illegally, because immigration into that area was illegal under the British mandate. And even up to and including post-World War II period. So they had to sneak into the country illegally and start being farmers, and the Arabs that lived in that area were shepherds and farmers. I mean, they weren't armies, but these two groups began having clashes between the Arab irregulars, which is what they called, and the Jewish underground, because they weren't even supposed to be there legally. And one of the few, it says friends, that the Jews had during this time period, okay, it was friends, was a guy by the name of Harry S. Truman. And in this partitioning then, Jerusalem was going to be set aside as an international zone that would be controlled by the, by the UN. But you know, that worked out real well. And so one of the few friends they had at that time period was Harry Truman. And listen to what he said in his memoirs. The question of Palestine as a Jewish homeland goes back to the solemn promise that has been made to them, meaning the Jews, by the British in the Balfour Declaration of 1917. A promise which has stirred the hopes and the dreams of these oppressed people. This promise, I felt, should be kept, just as all promises made by responsible civilized governments should be kept. And so by April of 1948, so this is a couple of years after the war, by April of 1948, the public favor started kind of turning to, on the favour-ometer, I don't know what to say, started turning over to the Jewish side of things. And on May 14th, independence was declared when the Jewish people, declared statehood. And here's a map of the land that was held. Okay, again, you can't see that, but and it's pretty similar if you look at a map today and carve out the West Bank and Gaza. It's pretty similar to what they have today. Not quite as much, but pretty similar. And over the next 75 years, the Lord is going to be perform tremendously miraculous things in the conflict of the establishment of the Jewish homeland. I mean, unbelievably, the Lord has been involved in that, most of which has been lost on the primarily secular Jewish mind. You know, the nation of Israel today is primarily a secular nation, just like the U.S. is primarily a secular nation. And they will grow over time as they win battle after battle over overwhelming odds, but they start beginning to think that it's due to their own prowess, you know, their own military strength or technology or their own fortitude, but keeping in mind that this is only God's way of moving pieces around on the chessboard. He's putting all this into play so that they declare statehood on May 14, 1948. Immediately, it was 4 Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, and Syria, declare war on this brand new 24-hour-old state. And they started advancing against them, against Israel. And Israel didn't even have an army. They didn't have any weaponry. And these Arab nations were all financed pretty much by Russia and had the latest Russian technology. And the Israelis suffered huge initial casualties, and Jerusalem was cut off at one point. But they were able, and they were, running out of supplies. And they didn't have first aid or food or anything like that, but they were able to establish a supply line. And the fighting ceased in 48 when they brought the Arabs. The Arab says, okay, uncle, 48 hours? I don't know. But they refused to sign a peace treaty. There's never been a peace treaty signed between Arabs. These Arabs, the Arab people of a couple of these nations, but the Arab people have never signed a peace treaty with Israel. And so the UN stepped in, as the UN likes to do, and they established what is known as the UN Green Line. So here's a map. Okay, again, there's a map. Kind of pretty much like that of the area that was controlled by Israel at statehood. But then the UN came in and said, yes, we'll put a stamp of approval pretty much on those same borders, and it was known as the Arab Greenland, or the Green L. And so the nation of Israel was established. Now, there was a number of skirmishes. There was a war between Israel and Egypt in the mid-50s, between 56 and 57. It was primarily over Sinai, sometimes called the Sinai Campaign. And following that campaign, there were several moves to unify the Arabs. These all little various Arab nations, there have been several moves to try to unify them. Getting those nations were trying to unify the Arabs that they were living in Egypt, living in Israel. After the Sinai campaign, there were several different attempts to try to get the Jews living in the new nation of Israel under some kind of an identity other than just the fact that they were Arabs living in Israel. And that all ended with a guy by the name of Yasser Arafat. Oh, I forgot this part. 76, or a little over 3/4 million Arab refugees or exiles during World War I, or during the War for Independence. Almost a quarter, or a little over 3/4 of a million Arab refugees or exiles. In other words, these were Arab people that were living in that area that was claimed by Israel at statehood. And so they left that area and they went in primarily to either Lebanon on the north, or Jordan, across the Jordan River, to the Transjordan side, the newly established nation of Jordan. There were an equal number of Jews that did the same thing, that were living primarily in Lebanon and Jordan. They left those areas either by being kicked out, ethnically cleansed, or just by running for their lives. And they ran into the area of Israel, equal number. And that's kind of important to understand. But after this campaign of 55 to 56 to 57, they started trying to unify the Arabs, because we're talking about 1955, 1956, 1957, trying to unify the Arabs in that area, and they ended up with the Arabs called that defeat of this whole thing, that the Nakba, which is the great disaster. And for several years of trying to unify the Arabs, a guy by the name of Yasser Arafat became the leader, and was later named as chairman of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO. And which was the group that the Arabs living in the West Bank and Gaza all became kind of semi-united under the PLO. And it wasn't on the surface, on their PR releases. It was so that they could have a national identity within the nation of Israel. They wanted the West Bank in Israel and West Bank in Gaza to be recognized as the homeland for the Palestinian Arabs. But in reality, that's what the newspaper headline said. That's what their press release said. But in reality, they just wanted Israel to not be there at all. And Yasser Arafat became the leader over this group, and then that happened during the 60s, 1967. And then in 1967 we come to what's called the Six-Day War. And here's an example of Cairo Radio, which was the Egyptian state-sponsored radio station. Here's a broadcast that they did on May 16, 1967. The existence of Israel has continued too long. We welcome the battle that we've long awaited. The peak hour has come. The battle has come in which we shall destroy Israel. King Hussein of Jordan on the 30th of May said this. The armies of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon are posed on the borders of Israel. To face the challenge while standing behind us are the armies of Iraq, Algeria, Kuwait, Sudan, and the whole Arab nation, meaning Saudi Arabia. This act will astound the world today. They will know that the Arabs are arranged for battle. The critical hour has arrived. We've reached the stage of serious action and not declaration. So that was May 30th. King Hussein, the next day, the Iraqi president, Rahman AR, said, "This is our opportunity to wipe out the ignominy that has been with us since 1948. The year that the declared statehood, our goal is to wipe Israel off the map." So it was clear to Israel that war was imminent, and they decided that they had to be proactive. So now it's important to keep in mind that the country's only been around less than 20 years at this point. Their military is the military equipment that they have primarily composed of World War II retreads. The only Air Force they have is some French Mirage first generation. First generation jet fighters. 25 or 15 old jet fighters from France, and this is all they had, and so they decided they had to be proactive though, and so on June 5th, Israel and Egypt had this state-of-the-art Air Force, and this was furnished by the USSR MiG fighters. And I mean, they probably the best Air Force in the area of all the Middle East. And so on May 5th, Israel's Mirage French fighters caught the Egyptians flat-footed and took out over 400 planes while they were still on the tarmac, effectively cutting the Egyptian Air Force off at the jugular. Ow, cat. And immediately Jordan and Syria retaliated. And that was on June 5th. And June 10th, they called for a ceasefire. Here's a map of Israel on June. Okay, again, I can't see it. June 5th, the day that they had proactively went into Egypt and took out their Egyptian fighter planes. On the while, they were still on the ground. This is the border of Israel, and this is a map of the land of Israel on June 10th. Okay, come on, man. No, seriously. Go lay on the heating pad and be warm. Stop, TJ. Keep scratching me. No! Okay. Because so he's showing a map of the land of Israel on June 10th, 1967, where they took the Golan Heights, which is an extremely strategic area between Israel and Syria and Israel and Lebanon. For that matter, the West Bank, which was sometimes called Samaria, even in modern terms, Gaza, which I remember reading that because we're reading, what are we reading in Daily Bread? I don't remember right now. It has escaped my brain. Okay, well, I don't remember. I don't think it's in Psalms, but I remember. I know I've read in the Old Testament talking about Gaza or Gaza Strip. So, anyways, it was called back then, and the Sinai Peninsula, Israel offered after the war. They offered to return 90% of all the land that they took during the Six-Day War, and Egypt and Syria refused to negotiate with them. So there was no peace treaty signed. They just stopped fighting, and so they didn't want their land back. So Israel kept it, and by the fall of 73, at this time, Israel is suffering from a tremendous dose of what we could call the Samson syndrome. Just like it doesn't matter whatever they bring, I'll squash it. And they weren't worried about anything. And so this time, Syria and Egypt acted proactively, and on Yom Kippur, 1973, they caught Israel kind of flat-footed. And the Syrians took over the Golan, and the Egyptians came in through Sinai, and they caught Israel off guard. Israel suffered a lot of heavy casualties initially, but after about a month, they began. They kind of collected themselves and started pushing back, and there were some ceasefires that were signed about a month after Yom Kippur. That's when the Syrians and the Egyptians saw that the war wasn't going their way. They signed a ceasefire. They never signed a peace treaty, but they did sign a ceasefire. And during the war, 2,700 Israeli soldiers died, and 8,500 Arab soldiers died during the Yom Kippur of 73. And the result of it, even though Egypt or Israel won the war, they kind of lost the PR war, and because Saudi Arabia blamed Israel for all of this, and that's what led to the very famous, or we could say the infamous, oil embargo of the late 70s, was the Yom Kippur War, and so the oil prices tripled. Ah, that must have been why we had a fuel shortage. I never understood what happened there, I guess. Anyways, long lines of gas pumps and everything. Jimmy Carter was president, and people were calling for his head, and this was all due to that. And also led to a whole series of anti-Israeli resolutions by we fast forward 1979 Carter, in an attempt to try to establish his legacy when people were wanting to, oust him. He was able to broker some peace negotiations between Anwar Sadat, who was the head of Egypt, and Monin bin, I guess that's how it's said, who was the head of Israel. And he got them all together, and Jimmy Carter was famous by saying, here we have three religions, here we have three religions, all serving the same God, and we're just going to hold hands and make nice. He ended up in 79, Egypt, Egypt, with Anwar Sadat, signed a peace treaty with Israel, first of the Arab nations. So to do so, they signed peace treaty with Israel, which led to later his assassination. But he signed the peace treaty with Israel, and since then there have been a whole number of I don't know what he's saying here, anatus, which means it's when a mullah or heir or an heir or some Muslim cleric will call for an anapat, means uprising or rebellion, a whole series of those in the Middle East. Too many to count. It depends on how 5 or 6, depending on how you categorize them. Oh God, cat. No wonder I'm choking. I'm almost done. I just lost my place because the smell just slapped me in the head. Okay, how you categorize them in the first half of the 90s when Clinton was president. He was negotiating in 93, 94. He was negotiating a peace deal between the Palestinians and Israel in what's known as the Oslo Accords. I remember that. And this was all done. I was in the army at that time. Hey. And this was all done off the books. It was supposed to be a super secret thing in Oslo. And they signed the PLO, and they signed this thing that known as the Oslo Accords. And in it, the PLO, or Palestinian Liberation Organization, became the Palestinian National Authority, or the PA. The PLO became the PA. So it's not PNA, it's just PA, Palestinian Authority, which meant that they were given a lot of autonomy before the Gaza and the West Bank were all under Israeli control. But as a result of the Oslo Accords, then they were given a certain degree. It was kind of like, you guys need to earn your autonomy, but we're going to give it to you as long as you make nice and, And then Jordan signed a peace treaty with Israel in 1994. Both of those peace treaties, Egypt and Jordan, still exist to this day. But a lot of suicide bombings and attacks, when all that started there's a whole bunch of that going on back then. A lot of different, as were raised, Anitas, I don't know what to say in there, were raised, and there was a lot of attacks on settlers. I hate that word. I have really learned to hate that word. Was in that all in direct and Israeli settlers that were in direct violation of the Oslo Accords, but the Arabs living in that area were doing so because they didn't want this peace deal that their leaders had gone and had received. And today Arabs living within the nation of Israel have full Arabic citizenship. They can vote in elections. They have, there's at least 8 members of the Israeli parliament, known as the Knesset. The Knesset. There's at least 8 members of the Knesset that are Arab, and they have more rights in this, and this is an underlining point. They have more rights. The Arabs living in Israel have more rights than the Arabs living in any other Arabic state. And the Arabs living in Israel have more rights than any Arabs living in any other country in the Middle East. The Palestinians have rejected virtually every peace accord that's been offered to them, and broken the ones that they did accept, that they were offered, like when they were offered statehood in 1948 and in 2000, both of which were rejected because they don't want statehood. They want the eradication of Israel, as we saw in those earlier quotes. I have news for them. God is not going to allow that. They've responded by those offers with armed aggression and terrorist attacks. And my question would be, if we go back to the earlier map, the Palestinian Mandate, most of the Palestinians which would be considered an Arab living in Palestine, and under the Palestinian Mandate, most of the Palestinians live in Jordan. Why don't they ever call for Anitas there? They are still living in refugee camps. 70 years later, they're still living in refugee camps. Why don't they call for uprisings there? But they don't. They only call for them in the land of Egypt or Israel. Today, officially, the Palestinian Authority, or the PA, has control and oversight over the Palestinian Authority. Has control over the West Bank and Gaza officially. The West Bank is semi-autonomous under the leadership of President Mahmoud Abbas, who is the legal president of the PA, and he rules over the West Bank. And Israel gives them a lot of autonomy, not total, but a lot of autonomy. But the Gaza, however, is under the leadership of the Hamas chairman. And you've heard a lot about Hamas in the last week. Oh boy. The chairman of the Hamas is a guy by the name of Ismail Haniyeh. And they've had pretty much autonomy. Israel hasn't had anything to do inside the borders of Gaza since 2005. There are 0 Israelis living in Gaza. No Jews. They've given them complete autonomy, and under the leadership of the PA and the Hamas thing, conditions have gotten from bad to worse under their leadership. These two dudes here, with respect to the political parties, they don't get along. I know it's kind of hard to understand 2 political parties. It's hard for our American minds to wrap our brains around 2 political parties fighting. But these guys don't get along, and so the West Bank is governed by the political party known as Fatah, and the Gaza is governed by the political party of Hamas. Is that right? Okay. Even though it's but it's not registered. It's not registered as it is recognized as a terrorist organization. It's also a political party that the inhabitants of Gaza voted for. Yeah, they voted for Hamas to be their leaders. So in a free and fair election, as free and fair as an election could be, there they chose Hamas. In addition to all of this mind-numbing craziness, there are a couple of other terrorist nations, or groups, that I think is important for us to understand. There's Hezbollah, which is headquartered in southern Lebanon, which is where the Lebanese refugees from Palestine went to the Arab during statehood. The ones that fled to the north went to Lebanon, and Lebanese government immediately put them in refugee camps, which still exist today. Oh, Jesus. What are you doing? Scare the... Oh man, that was about 9 cat lives came out of me just then. I don't know why that scared me. I was just startled me. Oh, I wasn't expecting to hear that noise. Sorry. I guess because I'm just really getting into what I'm reading here. So, the Lebanese refugees from Palestine went to the Arab during statehood. The ones that fled to the north went to Lebanon, and Lebanese government immediately put them in refugee camps, which still exist today. And that's where Hezbollah, Iranian-backed Hezbollah, has their headquarters. That's where they operate out of. And then the other terrorist group is known as the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is a technical term, which is technically in Gaza, but they do a lot of stuff in the West Bank as well. And they're under the leadership of the first one is under the leadership of the Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, and the second one is under the Secretary General I think part of it, Zed al-Nakla, however you say it. And here's what the Hamas Charter states, which is the ruling party in Gaza. Israel would exist and would continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. So the goal hasn't changed. That's still what they want to do. The goal, not gold. The goal has not changed. That's still what they want to do. In fact, the guy that's the head of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, he said He said the Jews are a cancer, which is liable to spread again at any moment. He said there's no solution to the conflict except with the disposal or disappearance of Israel. If they all gather in Israel, it will save us the trouble of going after them worldwide. That's what the head of Hezbollah said. And I'm sure all these guys that I've mentioned are hard-working dudes. The leaders, I'm sure they are. And to know, and to you know, a workman is worthy of his wages. I hope I don't come off as judging the leaders' motives in this, but it looks like these guys are have got some pretty good gigs. Yasser Arafat, Yasser, whatever, Arafat at his death, Yasser Arafat at his death back in the early ODS. I don't know what that's supposed to be. But he died of a stroke or a heart attack. I forgot. He was worth well over $1 billion at his death. Muhammad, it's MMUD, so I know there's something missing there. It's just the way he said it. Whenever I have it do subtitles for what I'm saying, it gets some weird things in there because of accent. I have like half Yankee, half Okie accent. But anyways, Abbas, the president of the PA, is worth over $100 million. Hassan Nasrallah is the general. It's the Secretary General Secretary. He said it weird. Of his Hezbollah, and he's worth $1.5 million. And the guy that you probably never heard of, Ishma Hanna, generally Secretary of Hamas, is worth $5 million. And these guys say that they are only concerned about the plight of the Palestinian people. And I would say, if so, then do something about it. You know, stop brainwashing your children from infancy to grow up thinking that the only way, the best way that they can please their God is to ethnically cleanse all Jews from the earth. Is to kill a Jew. And if you want to really please them, do so in a very slow and painful way. Get over this whole great Satan, little Satan thing and start working for the good of your people instead of the good of your bank accounts. That's what I'd say to these guys. I mean, there's no question that this piece of real estate on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean belongs to Israel. Yeah, but they took it by war. Someone will even say that we're the whole story, and it's not. That if that were the whole story, and it's not, but even if that were the whole story, what nation hasn't? Can you name a nation that has not? In fact, they took it from the people who took it from the people who took it from the people who took it from the people. I mean, that's just been the history of mankind since the book of Genesis. Amen, Pastor. And has Israel been the best landlords in the last 75 years? Maybe not. But then again, what nation has been? You know, do we want to start virtue signaling right now as Americans the way we've run the United States in the last 225, almost 200, almost 250 years. U.S. sucks the way it treats people in other countries. I said that. Ezekiel 11:17 says, "Therefore say, thus says the Lord God, I will gather you from the peoples, assemble you from the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give you the land of Israel." This wasn't talking about Abraham 4,000 years ago. This was talking eschatologically. I can't say that. Eschatologically. Okay, in eschatology teaching. We would start looking at the end time clock that I believe began, 200 years ago. God gave this land to the Jews forever. Period. Okay? The time clock, I truly believe, started in 1948. When Jesus says, "No, this generation shall not pass until these things come to be," when he's talking about that. And the generation, no dot and no tittle, nothing is going to be left undone before this generation passes. Anyways, you know what I'm talking about. We are convinced, everyone that I follow and everyone that I've ever talked to and any pastor I've ever listened to, it started, that's the generation that Jesus was referring to, started in 1948 when all the Israelis, God started bringing them back in 1917. And since this war thing has started, since October of last year, Jews are just flocking back to Israel because they feel safer in their land where there's a war going on than in the country that they're currently living in, whether it's here or Europe or wherever, because of the anti-Semitic uproar. People are screaming, "From the river to the sea, Palestine should be free," or whatever they're saying, which is a lie, which is crap, because 90% of them probably don't realize they're calling for every Jew in the world to be killed. Or maybe they do. Maybe they do know what they're saying. If we start looking at the clock, and he says, I believe it began 200 years ago. God gave this land to the Jews forever, period. Okay? Here's the thing. This would be the point to underline. That is what, number 5. Here's the thing. Both sides of this conflict hasn't got Jesus. Okay? Both sides of this conflict need Jesus. Every day there are people dying on both sides of this conflict or going into eternity without Jesus. And so at what point do we let that truth rise up to the top and allow it to trump our politics and change the way we view all this? I mean, it belongs to Israel. I get that. And I am an Israel supporter. I got that. Have you seen okay, he's off. Yeah, he's been to Israel. He's got an Israeli flag. He's got all kinds of Israel stuff in there. So Calvary Chapel in Oklahoma definitely stands with Israel. He says, I dig the nation of Israel. They're God's chosen people, but they're not walking with God. He's using all of this. He's working all this stuff out, and he's assigning the chess pieces around so that he can reveal himself to the Jews. And if the Jews think that that's what's happened in the last week or the last 75, 80 years or something, they haven't seen nothing yet. And that breaks my heart. Yeah, it does. That breaks my heart too, because we know that in the 7-year tribulation, at the midpoint, when Satan sits down in the Holy of Holies and says, I'm your God now, worship me, right? That's when they're going to realize that this is not their Messiah. And that's when he says, when you see I can never remember that. The desecration, whatever it is, I don't know why I can never remember that. When you see that happen, him sit down and say, worship me, he ends their worship, their sacrifices, and they have to start worshiping him because he's their God. If you're on the roof, just go. Don't even go back into your house. If you forgot your cloak, just keep going. He's basically telling you, flee, get out of there, because he's going to turn on the Jews and he's going to start slaughtering them. And 2/3 of the Jews will be killed during the great part of the Great Tribulation. The last half of the tribulation period is called the Great Tribulation, because that's when the Antichrist shows his true colors and he starts killing Christians and Jews. And 2/3 of the Jews will be slaughtered. Only 1/3, a remnant, will be saved. and there's, was it Petra? Petra. There's an area called Petra. Some people think that that's where the Garden of Eden is, only in a different realm. But Petra, right now, there's nobody living there. No one lives there in Petra. And a lot of people, I've heard a lot of people say that they think that maybe where God is intending to bring the Jews that are saved, the remnant. But that's just a lot of people's opinion, but we don't know for fact. We don't have anything concrete to say that that's what it is, but it's what a lot of us are thinking. But anyways, it breaks his heart and it breaks mine too, what it's going to take for them to realize that Jesus is their Messiah. Because when at the end of the 7-year tribulation, when Jesus returns with his saints, us, and his army, right, they will look upon the one whom they pierced, and it's then they will realize who their true Messiah is. Amen. So, but they take that for them to realize that Jesus is their Messiah, but they will. It's just Jews. I've got a lot of Jewish friends. And and they will be the first to agree with some hard-headed people, or stiff-necked, as God calls them. And it's going to be really hard for them to come to the place where they will have to acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah. But they will. And yes, Yeshua is on the throne. He's totally in charge. And what I take away in this is how Lord, do you want me to pray for what's going on over there right now? I mean, what is my role as a Christian? Removes thousands of miles away with limited resources, that they live thousands of miles away with limited resources. What can I do but pray? And how would you have me pray? Many people have asked me too, and I'm going to wrap it up with this. Many people have asked me whether or not these current events fit into the end time scenario. I've been asked that for a number of years, but just especially in the last week, and I too, that I would say, of course, but then those who follow what I would call the headline Eastist, I don't know what he's saying there. The ones that are not against them. Some of my friends are headline eschatologists. Some of my best friends are. But they kind of interpret eschatology by the latest headline. And those who do so will fit any current event into an end time scenario. And so, so there's that. Of course, you look at what's happened since this a year ago, and I bet he's taking those words back now. This is the last, what we are in the 8th day of, now it feels like an end time scenario. And by that I'm talking about, some sort of touchy-feely liver quiver or 9/11 kind of end time in eschatology, because we all thought 9/11 felt like that, and that was a long time ago. And it did, and it was. But we know now that those planes in 9/11 were not hijacked. I knew it was false flag planting. Anyways. I think it just feels, it's got the vibe of end times all over. Russia and Iran have been close, have never been closer. Oh, they're in bed with each other now. There's no Islamic nation with a greater hatred of Israel than Iran. The Middle East, which Iran used to be Persia. Yeah. Esther and King Xerxes. That Persia. Yeah, not a trip. Nations, non-Geo, non-Israeli, Middle Eastern nations fighting over Israel is on a level of 11 out of 10. 11 out of 10 right now. I mean, after 9/11, you never saw nations around the world chanting and having marches in favor of Al-Qaeda, and there have been a lot, this is Israel's, 9/11, and there have been marches all over, giving gifts to each other. Sound familiar? In major cities in the United States, supporting the Palestinians, supporting Hamas, supporting what happened, right? When babies were beheaded in the Middle East. their nations are bent on the eradication of the Jews. The worst thing, I will never forget it, that they did is this pregnant woman, they cut her open, cut her baby out, made her, before she died, watch them behead her baby that they had just taken from her belly. That's straight evil. That is demonic. But I don't think any nation will gain more from what kind of fomenting that Russia will than Putin right now. He digs this. Not only does it turn attention away from Ukraine, but this is going to result in some great oil hikes, and they're an oil-producing nation, and so they're going to love the price of gas if this continues. So much of this, I think, has this lace up your rapper shoes, rapture shoes kind of vibe about it. But then I've said, quite a bit, and again, this is, but then part 3. So did the events of 2 weeks ago, or a week ago, whatever, 3 weeks ago, and 4 weeks ago, I mean, I've had my shoes laced up for 4 decades now, that's what he's saying. One of these weeks, one of these days, one of these hours is going to be the hour, and it's going to be the minute, and no minute in all the history of the world has been better than this one for the rapture. And so our job as Christians who are looking for the Lord, Titus 2:13, looking for our blessed hope and the glorious appearing of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. Or Luke 21, verse 28. Now when you see these things begin to happen, look up and lift up your head, because your redemption draws near. Not anything for us to lose sleep over. It's something to be excited about. I grieve over the loss of life. I would like it to end, but I know it's only the beginning one way or the other. But it's all in God's plan. He's still in charge. He's still on the throne. And His will is still going to be accomplished. Amen. God, we just thank you. Lord, we thank you for this. We just thank you for your word and for helping us to understand the history of your people and the times that we're in, and how close it is for Jesus to come for the church, to remove the restrainer so that the Antichrist can come on the scene. And there's so much chaos in the world now, Lord, that there's just any time he could come. Father, there's a lot of people that do not know your Son, that do not know Yeshua as their personal Lord and Savior. They don't know him as their Mashiach. Father, I just ask that you help those that are believers to get off their pews and get out in the world and start sharing the gospel with everyone they can. Every person they meet, ask them, do you know my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, when they shake their hands to greet him. Father, help us to just have an overwhelming desire to do your business, to be about your business, Father, and to do your will, and to do the great commission that Jesus called us to do. Help us to be the salt and light of the earth, to give them hope and let them know, no matter how dark it may look, the darkness will never overcome the light. And we just praise you and we thank you and we glorify your precious name, Jesus. And in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So that's all. It's probably longer than I wanted it to be, and I apologize if it was. But I hope you have a blessed rest of your night. Shalom. Oh, Shabbat Shalom. That's right.